White House has put out on big data and how that impacts HR and what you need to know. Joining us today, we have two presenters who I'd like to take a moment to introduce. First up from Evolve, we have Dr. Michael Housman. He's the Chief Analytics Officer at Evolve, where he applies state-of-the-art statistical methodologies and econometric techniques to databases consisting of hundreds of millions of employee records in order to answer two fundamental questions. One, what keeps people on the job longer? And two, what allows them to perform better? So Dr. Housman is going to join us today to talk about some of these practices and how it's applied to HR. Also on the call, we're really pleased to have with us from Littler, Marko Mrkonich. I hope I got that right, Marko, who is an attorney at law at Littler, and he has practiced management side labor and employment law for more than 30 years, handling everything from union campaigns to complex employment law class actions, and day-to-day counseling to negotiation of senior executive employment agreements. So, Marko, pleased to have you on the call with us today.
Thank you.
So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Michael Housman.
Great. Thanks very much, Julie. So in terms of the agenda for today's webinar, we've broken it down into two pieces. To start, we want to just talk broadly about big data, what it is, what its definition is, in essence, kind of how it's being used. But then we want to understand how it's being used specifically with regards to the workforce. So trying to understand how big data is being used to, pick the best talent and keep people on the job longer and to allow them to perform better. Now, a subset of this is to try to understand some of the legal and regulatory issues that are at stake here. And that's why we're very privileged to have Marko on the line because he is the expert on these topics. And so he's going to share some of his viewpoints on some of those legal and regulatory issues. Second, we're going to talk about the White House Big Data Report. So it's very exciting. President Obama released a Big Data Report a little over a month ago that talked about kind of the use of big data as it is applied to a number of different industries. And it talked about some of the benefits that it potentially poses, as well as some of the risks that are there. And so what we've done is gone through the report, and we've come out with 5 key takeaways from the report that businesses should be on the lookout for. And while the report isn't necessarily something that's going to change the way things work overnight, we see a number of different issues coming down the pike. And so we've been advising various organizations and our clients how to anticipate those issues and get ahead of the ball. Likewise, with each of those 5 takeaways, we want to issue some real-world examples. So we're going to be very concrete and offer up some examples of how different businesses and organizations are addressing each of those points. And that allows organizations on this call to understand how they can potentially be thinking about these issues. So to start, I want to talk broadly about big data, and then we'll talk about how it's being used specifically with regards to HR. So we're in the middle of a big data revolution. If you can't see it in the media, you can see it in terms of the way organizations are using big data to drive value. So a lot of people are talking about it. The origin of this, we often like to point to the quintessential example, which is the Oakland Athletics, using this in Moneyball. Michael Lewis talked about how the Oakland A's pioneered a new approach towards evaluating talent within baseball. And rather than using the gut instinct and intuition that scouts had built up over a number of decades, they took a different approach and utilized sabermetrics and different predictive analytics and statistical models to predict which ball players would be the most successful. And generally they encountered a lot of success in this approach, and so that's part of the reason why it's made its way across a number of different industries. When we think about financial services, it really wasn't that long ago that large financial institutions would, to understand people's credit worthiness, would actually call banks or credit cards and say, hey, what do you think of Bob in terms of credit worthiness? Again, it seems kind of archaic now, but this is the way things used to be until the emergence of credit scores and various other ways of really understanding and pinpointing what someone's credit worthiness truly is based on previous behavior and transaction history. We've seen this emergence within healthcare. It's actually not that long that evidence-based medicine has been really making inroads within healthcare. There are studies, for example, that show maybe a decade ago, when you went into a hospital to give birth, the likelihood you would get a cesarean section or not differed tenfold, holding everything else constant, simply by virtue of the doctor or the hospital that you visited. So these are differences in practice patterns that ultimately resulted in very different approaches and outcomes. And so the idea is to take that noise out and to look for a systematic, evidence-based and data-driven approach towards making diagnoses and practicing healthcare. And now we're seeing the emergence within the workforce. Increasingly, we're seeing organizations that are using this same data-driven, evidence-based approach to drive decisions within the workforce. And there are decisions that occur throughout all stages of the employee life cycle. For example, who to hire, who to train them, how to train them, who to develop them, so on and so forth. And so the idea is that we want to take that gut instinct and intuition out of the process and to be doing this in a fairly standardized way that's scalable. So we should take a step back and answer a very fundamental question, which is, what is big data? And the definition that we've adopted is similar to what's out there in the media, which is we define it in terms of the 3 V's. It's volume, variety, and velocity. So to start with volume, we're seeing now larger and larger data sets becoming available for analysis. Now, of course, that's generally true of the internet, but we're seeing that true also of workforce and employment data in general, specifically. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later in the presentation. In terms of variety, this data is becoming available from far more sources than was ever the case in the past. When we think about workforce data, it was typically the case that all that data lived within an HRMS, a human resource management system. Well, that's no longer the case. Now this data exists in a number of different systems and in various sources like social media, resume data. And again, I'll outline a few examples of that in a little bit. And then finally, in terms of velocity, previously it was the case that these data sets would be updated perhaps monthly, maybe weekly, perhaps on a daily basis. Now it's becoming the case that they are being updated hourly. More data is being generated by the minute. And in fact, in real time, again, things like Twitter feeds and Facebook and LinkedIn data is constantly generating new streams of data that can be brought to bear on these fundamental questions. So before I talk about the workforce, I want to actually open this up for a poll. So Kathy, if you want to ask a poll question about the big data initiatives, that would be great. Great, so the question that we're asking people is, does your organization have a big data initiative planned for the coming year? And that's independent of the workforce. We just want to understand how many organizations are really thinking and acting upon big data. So we'll leave the poll open for, say, a minute, and we'll gather responses. Okay. Great. Well, I think we can close the poll. And it looks like it's a 50-50 split, which is really interesting. We're seeing, this actually mirrors what we've seen amongst clients, among the industry in general, that about half of organizations are engaging in these big data initiatives, are integrating different data streams, and bringing in the technical expertise necessary to analyze the big data and answer some fundamental questions. And again, we're expecting this number obviously to increase in the future as more and more organizations realize the power of big data and, in essence, its ability to level the playing field, to allow organizations to succeed and create value. So let me talk about big data in the workforce. And what you see here are a number of headlines from major publications that are talking about how big data is making inroads when we talk about our people. This has really gained a ton of press and traction within the past year and a half alone. During that time, we've seen articles within the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, The Economist, The Atlantic Monthly, Financial Times, everyone's really starting to pay attention to the fact that large companies are using big data on an increasing basis in order to track their employees and ultimately in order to find ways to help them stay longer and to perform better. Again, we expect that this trend will only increase in the future. So then it begs the question, why now? Why are people paying attention to this issue now as opposed to 10, 15 years ago? Well, there's really the confluence of two factors that are driving this trend. First, it's just a shift in the economy. So what you see in the bottom of the screen are the largest companies in the US in 1960 and 2010. Now the blue bubbles represent service-based companies, and the orange bubbles represent manufacturing or goods-producing companies. So if you look in 1960, the biggest companies in the US tended to be goods-producing. They tended to be manufacturing. What we've seen change over time is the nature of business in the US. The fact of the matter is that the US really doesn't make things that much anymore. And so increasingly, we're seeing those blue bubbles, service-producing companies that are really employing the majority of the American workforce and providing a large number of services. Now, within a service economy, what's your most strategic asset? It's really your frontline workforce. It's your people. They are the ones that provide the brand experience and perception that people have when they interact with the brand. And so when you're thinking about customer experience and customer service, it's those people that are the sort of frontline caretakers for your customers. And so within that world, this is why people and human capital are becoming a more and more strategic asset over time. Now, likewise, we're also seeing the growth of data that can be brought to bear on these people. So when we think about all data in general, the prediction is that from 2011 to 2020, the amount of data that's available will grow 44 times to 35 zettabytes. And just to give you a sense of magnitude, a zettabyte is 1 billion terabytes. So again, we're talking about larger and larger stores of data. And the quote on the left is a little bit facetious, but the idea is that big data is here, people are talking about it, but we found that very few organizations have figured out exactly what to do with it. And so it's an exciting time. We're really seeing the maturity of big data in general, but especially within the workforce, we're starting to see big data make some serious inroads. So I mentioned before the 3 V's, volume, variety, and velocity. I talked a little bit about volume. In terms of variety, this data is coming from a number of different sources that are really new and exciting. So previously, it was those core HRMS systems like PeopleSoft. That's where most of that data came from. Well, now we're starting to see the walls broken down, and the data, which was previously siloed, is being integrated within data integration engines and warehouses. So we're seeing, for example, pre-hire assessment data. We're seeing talent management, applicant tracking systems. We're seeing learning management systems that helps people get up the learning curve and trains them. CRM data, customer experience management, and then of course performance management data as well. And on top of all that data that's really housed within the organization, we're seeing layered on top of it publicly available data. So econometric data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the Census Bureau, on wage rates, a variety of different sources. And then what's emerging now is unstructured data. That was, of course, resume data back in the day, but now you can think of Twitter data, LinkedIn data, data from a number of different sources that are being integrated to be able to engage in workforce and people analytics. So what this is enabling is, as I mentioned, a data-driven, evidence-based approach to workforce performance management. The bottom panel really outlines the way the world has been, in which people are chosen for these jobs based on fairly subjective hiring criteria, gut instinct and intuition. Candidates are disqualified based on that intuition and bias. When we train people, we do it according to the way we've typically done so. People are managed and developed according to previous processes. They're assigned fairly randomly to managers who hopefully develop them as well as they can. And when we promote and separate individuals, We do it based on what we think matters rather than on data. And where we think the world is really headed is injecting that data into each of these decisions throughout the employee life cycle. So ultimately, science-based assessments and data is what's allowing hiring managers to make a very strong decision for who they should hire. People are trained according to what training styles and curriculum truly work, as validated by the data. Management styles and assignment to managers are being done according to pairing and fit that we're able to validate in data. And when we make decisions around promotions and retention or separation, it's being done in a data-driven way so that those decisions are being linked to what truly drives performance. So with that, I actually wanted to open up to the second poll, which is what is your biggest challenge when it comes to workforce performance? So Kathy, if you don't mind opening up that poll, we have 5 options that we're making available: attrition, customer satisfaction, process efficiency, sales conversion, or schedule adherence. So what we're trying to understand is, for those individuals on the call, which are the workforce outcomes that they really care about the most. I'll leave the poll open for about a minute. I'll talk about the results, and then I'll hand it off to Marko. Okay. Great. Well, I think the numbers have stabilized. So what we see is actually, it's interesting, a two-way tie between attrition and process efficiency. And I will say that that actually does validate what we've heard from our clients and the encounters that we've had with organizations throughout the industry. Typically, by and large, attrition is the #1 pain point, and it really matters. When you can keep people on the job longer, they provide a better experience, they tend to be more productive. You know, we ultimately want a more experienced workforce. But process efficiency is also important, just in terms of being able to kind of process the people quickly, efficiently, and effectively. So with that, let me actually hand it off to Marko. Oh, sorry, I'm gonna add one more piece before I hand it off, and I just want to talk very briefly about why HR is unique. And we know that HR is unique for 3 primary reasons. First off, the data that you use, the methodologies that you employ, there are a number of different ways in which those findings are unique for the HR world, as opposed to if we were trying to optimize our marketing spend. Likewise, we have a different set of values and implications when we're talking about employment decisions. We don't think about hiring people, for example, in the same way we think about direct marketing and who we want to market to. And one of the reasons why it is unique is that there are protected classes that exist. So typically in marketing, you know, for example, things are fair game. We can use things like age, gender, and race. When we're talking about HR, we can't use those things because we feel differently about the decision-making process. We want to give everyone a fair shot. And of course, the expert on all of these things is Marko, so I'll actually hand it off to him to talk a little bit about why HR is unique and some of the legal and ethical implications to be thinking about when we're talking about big data.
Thank you, Michael, very much, and thank you for a really fascinating introduction to the topic today. One of the challenges that we face in human resources is that half of the things we approach solve problems, and it seems that the other half create problems. Big data, in the minds of many involved in human resources, both solves problems and creates new problems. So the challenge that we face as lawyers and advisors in the field is trying to figure out how to use big data in order to make employment better, both more effective, more legal, more compliant, and more efficient. The difficulty is that every time a new idea comes along, people seem to line up and take hints. And to some in human resources, they prefer a system where they sit down and evaluate each resume and develop a feel for the resume and a feel for the person and a feel for the candidate or a feel for the performance window. On the other hand, you have people who say you don't need to do any of that. If you look at the data, they will tell you who the winners are and who the losers are. So when we think of a college application, those who want to go the soft route say, let me read the essay. And those who want to go the data-driven route say, well, let me see the test scores and the class rank. And no one is always 100% right or 100% wrong on their perceptions. A lot of it is a language issue that we have to sort through as we apply big data to employment decisions. Because I will tell you this, whether you like it or don't like it, big data will not go away. It's being used in marketing, it's being used in credit applications, it's being used in deciding how to run baseball teams. So it's not going to go away from what we do in routine, everyday employment decisions, whether it affects hiring. How do you select the best people to fill your jobs? What matters for you? I will give you an example from a conversation I had after Michael and I had the good fortune to make a presentation on this same topic elsewhere. And I sat down with the commissioner and she said, you know, I understand what you're talking about because the topic that was involved was sort of what makes a great bank teller. Do you want to hire people into a fairly high turnover job generally because they have upward mobility skills, or do you want people to take that job because they're going to stay there a long time? And only employers can answer the question, but we can predict a little bit about what makeup goes into each category of person. So the commissioner shared her observation that when she was back home with her mother in the small town in which she grew up, the bank tellers were the same bank tellers that were there when she was in high school. On the other hand, in suburban Washington, D.C., if she happened to run into the same bank teller in a transaction separated by a matter of hours, that was an unusual coincidence. What's the right model? Well, no one can tell you what the right model is, but what people can tell you is that when you look at the big data information that's out there for you to use, you can make more effective hiring decisions by tying the big data analytics to what you're looking for. In this high turnover job, are you looking for stability? How about in this position, are you looking for growth? So when you're making hiring decisions, you can use the analytics available to you to make better decisions. But the naysayers are out there too. They say, well, if we use these data, aren't we going to create more risk of discrimination? Well, of course, the advocates of big data will tell you, no, you'll actually be eliminating discrimination. Because instead of relying on a person who might have individual biases and individual idiosyncrasies that make it harder for them to evaluate candidates without respect to EEO categories, you're going to be relying on objective factors that tie directly to career success. So you're going to be leveling the playing field and eliminating discrimination. And others will say, well, what if there's an adverse impact? And that's where we as lawyers come in to make sure that the way you're applying big data to a hiring decision is specifically tied to that decision, that it's the least restrictive way possible to go about getting that information, and to make sure that when you're all done, that it's validated to the job performance and the job characteristics that matter. With hiring, it's a little bit more complicated because you want to make sure that you're asking people the right questions at the right time to fit into your model. So if, for example, you have a model that says, for example, that people who have worked for one of the three largest fast food franchises are more likely to stay in your job for longer than people who haven't. So you might ask a question on your application, have you ever worked at a major fast food franchise before? On the other hand, what if that correlates to, distance from the workplace, and your workplace is in a primarily white neighborhood or a primarily African-American neighborhood? Does this become a way to steer people into sort of homogeneous racial components that don't match up with the EEO laws? So you have to be careful and you have to be thoughtful, but you can't put your head in the sand and pretend it's not there. The same thing applies to performance reviews and promotions. So what are the testing laws? What are the privacy concerns? And what are the disparate impact? We can advance the slide. Because we looked at hiring in depth, and we understand that in performance you have not only what's on an application, but what you've observed. And when you're coming time to decide who gets promoted, you've got the same information available to you, subjective impressions versus data analytics. And I always ask people, would you rather keep the assistant who can type 100 words a minute and generates 10 letters a day, or the assistant who types 70 words a minute but generates 20 letters a day? It sort of depends on what you're trying to do. If you have to operate under tight deadlines, typing speed might matter more. If you're trying to be steady and methodical, it might be that sustained productivity is more important. So when you manage the risk and look at the hot topics, you have to ask, what are all the testing laws out there? You know, is it going to be the Americans with Disabilities Act? Will it be something that brings an adverse impact that connects to gender, race, or national origin? How are we going to go about doing these testing laws and respecting the privacy rights, the Genetic Information and Non-Disclosure Act? It might be that people, for example, have academic history that involves protected category type things like dyslexia or other learning disabilities. And then finally, even when you get beyond the privacy issues, which again are all manageable but need to be attended to, you get the question about disparate impact. And remember, this is something that's on its face, has nothing to do with the protected category. Think, for example, back to the old airline days when they required that all flight attendants must be more than so many inches tall. And Asian females brought a class action and said, you're disproportionately excluding us. And the airline said, well, you need to be able to reach to the luggage containers overhead. And the flight attendant said, no, that's not really important. As long as someone on the crew can do that, you don't need everyone on the crew to do that. And you went through all that stuff. So it's kind of unintentional discrimination where you say, if we use this factor, it has a disproportionate effect on people in a protected category. Is it still okay to use? The answer is it might be. But you have to be careful, and you have to make sure that you don't just accept the mere existence of a correlation for something that you can use in a particular case. But if you've got a strong correlation, it would be a shame not to use it to recruit, retain, and promote a more effective and better workforce. And it's this sort of juxtaposition of using data to defend sound employment decision-making versus the risk of invading someone's privacy or making a stereotype-based decision that keeps everyone up at night and saying, do I really need to do this? Well, the answer is you can't avoid it. It's coming, it's there, the information's there. And it's because of this potential for conflict in the workplace that leads the White House to study it and leads people in my shoes to be visiting with clients about it on a virtual daily basis and trying to work through the right ways to use big data. I said it at the beginning. I don't think a choice is to close the door and pretend it doesn't exist. Banks don't do that. Marketing companies don't do that. Insurance companies don't do that. There's no reason employers can expect to get away with it long term. But what you can do is say we're going to use it right. We're going to use it to minimize discrimination, not promote discrimination. We're going to make sure it ties to job-related characteristics that we can defend. And we're going to listen to what Michael Housman will tell us the White House has to say about this.
Thanks very much, Marko, and outstanding segue. So yeah, we want to move on. We want to talk about what the White House is saying about big data. And again, we're going to draw some specific examples of companies that have applied this common knowledge to their workforce. So to start, I'll set the stage. I'll say that it was released in May 2014, so a couple months ago, a big data report that talked about two things. First, the benefits. What it did was it recognized that there are a number of benefits that big data can potentially offer in various sectors. It pointed out that transportation and infrastructure was being facilitated by big data. It pointed out that medical decision-making and diagnoses were being made better because of the existence of big data. So it's an exciting time. At the same time, though, it did point out that there are some risks here, and there are some things to be cautious of and aware of as well. So again, we've talked about some of the benefits with respect to the workforce, how it can help organizations make better hiring and development decisions. But what we're going to really focus on today are some of the risks. And our take is that there were really 5 key takeaways that came out of that report. And ultimately, those 5 are what's going to allow organizations to maximize the benefit that they achieve from their big data initiatives while minimizing the risk. So we'll go through each one in a little bit more detail, but to unpack them, those 5 are first, it needs to be targeted. So big data initiatives need to be targeted and purposeful and intended to answer a specific question. Second, they need to be transparent. We want to be very clear and transparent and above board about what data is being collected and how it's being used. Of course, we want to be ethical. When we're making these decisions and capturing this data and using it to make decisions, we want to make sure that that's being done in a fairly ethical way. The fourth is technical expertise. We need to recognize that we need the right skills and tools and techniques in order to analyze this data properly, or we're going to land at the exact wrong conclusion. And then fifth is we need to be collaborative. So when we don't find the right skills in-house, then we need to be willing to look outside the organization in order to collaborate and achieve those goals. So let's start first with that first bullet that I mentioned, targeted. And this is really about being purposeful with your data. It's about having a clear hypothesis and a research question in mind without having any a priori assumptions about what might or might not predict. Now, as Marko mentioned, we need to ask the right questions. So especially when we're talking about workforce initiatives, we need to be very careful when we're dealing with protected classes, age, sex, race. These are all things that we need to be careful of. When we run those analyses, even if we don't use the results, we're potentially culpable for having run the analyses and generating findings. And then finally, the key here, and for me the real takeaway, is that we want to avoid fishing expeditions. So the data that we pull needs to be relevant and germane to the question that we're trying to ask. We don't want to pull everything under the sun and run every possible correlation. While that can be advisable in some academic settings, that's not advisable here when there are broader implications. We need to, again, be very targeted in terms of what question are we asking and how are we using data to answer those questions. So there are a couple examples that come to mind that illustrate how companies are being targeted with their data. One is a large financial management and advisory company that was suffering from a large number of employment lawsuits that were alleging racial discrimination. And so what they decided to do was deploy a pre-hire assessment that was, again, very data-driven. So they couldn't use anything that was just off the shelf. They needed to use the one that was data-driven so that assessment responses would be linked to on-the-job outcomes. And they found that this evidence-based approach ultimately removed bias from employment decisions, that in some part the hiring managers were having these decisions kind of handed off to the assessment, or at least shared, so that it wasn't purely a hiring manager's impression of a candidate, but also their score on the assessment that they could point to and say, this was the candidate's score. This is evidence that it wasn't done in a biased way. Those scores, again, were aligned with on-the-job outcomes in a very data-driven way, in a way that was very transparent. And when those scores that we knew were linked to on-the-job outcomes were used in hiring decisions, it avoided the utilization of protected class information. We were deciding based on what really mattered and eliminating things that we didn't want to consider. And ultimately, it led to a less biased, more data-driven and evidence-based approach to hiring. Likewise, we're very proud to say that it was actually just yesterday that the White House released another report called Ready to Work. And essentially it looked at how we can employ more people in the population, the workforce, but specifically focused on the long-term unemployed. Some of you may remember that Obama, in his State of the Union address, pointed out that we need to be better about hiring long-term unemployed individuals. Research has shown that they perform on par with individuals that have more traditional work histories, and yet if you have a long-term unemployment spell on your resume, you need 8 years more experience to compensate for that in the eyes of a recruiter. Now, among the 300 companies that took that pledge, that signed on to Obama's request, are AT&T, Xerox, and Kelly Services that are clients of ours, and they cited their use of Evolve's platform as having helped them improve their hiring process by hiring on the basis of what truly matters and not considering things that don't matter, like, for example, someone's long-term unemployed status. We've used data in order to debunk a number of myths around hiring practices. So when we think about work history, we know that recruiters spend an average of 7 seconds examining resumes. And what do they look for? Well, they look for unusual work histories, like job hopping and long-term unemployed. We found in our data that they stay just as long and perform just as well as individuals with more traditional work histories. And we've even gone so far as to look at job-relevant work experience and education, and we found in a number of frontline roles where experience really isn't as much a factor, that those aren't predictive. So just because someone has had fast food experience doesn't mean that they necessarily are well suited for another fast food job. If anything, the fact that they left the job might be indicative of the fact that they weren't a good fit. Well, all this is to say that it's important to use data in a purposeful way in order to dispel myths and to figure out what truly matters and what doesn't matter. And of course, we're going to use the criteria that does matter, and we're going to ignore the things that don't. Second, transparency. We think transparency is paramount here. Unfortunately, there are organizations that do shadow data capture, so capturing information on their consumers or on their employees that isn't readily apparent. And we think that that's made big data somewhat infamous. So people are a little bit on alert because of this quote unquote creepy data capture. So first and foremost, data must be captured in a legal and ethical way. Now, not surprisingly, the White House report encouraged greater transparency when it comes to data capture. And we think that a good rule of thumb here is that if you feel compelled to conceal the source or the methods you use with your data, it's probably a good sign that you're doing something wrong. That the ultimate sniff test here should be, are you willing to share that with consumers, with your employees? Are you willing to tell them what data is being used to make these decisions? Now again, we actually look to our own assessment as an example of transparency, in that on the opening login screen, we've highlighted sections of the assessment that say exactly what's being captured and why. So we indicate early on that people are going to be asked for this data in order to complete their application and to be considered for employment. But later we want to point out, your privacy is very serious to us. We're not going to distribute this information to any third parties. The only way in which this data will be used is to make an assessment of your appropriateness for this job. And so we think it's important to highlight that, and rather than using cookies or other information that people don't give us, we really only use the information that people do give us in the application when we're rendering a scoring decision. So ethics, again, this may sound fairly straightforward, but ethics are important. We need to make sure that those guidelines are, as I mentioned before, they need to be clear and transparent, and we need to share them across the industry. We think over time that there's going to be an amalgamation of best practices when it comes to big data. There'll be certain practices that are widely accepted, and then there will be others that are frowned upon. We want to avoid any ambiguity. When we're working on these sort of ethical guidelines, we want to err on the side of over-disclosing and being incredibly upfront about what we're doing and how we're doing it. That's ultimately the way that we can avoid any unintended consequences of gathering data. And we found, when we've talked about ethics within here, our practice here at Evolve, that it actually offered an opportunity to do some really interesting organizational soul searching. So I'm sitting here across from Julie, and we're surrounded by others who, when we were thinking about our code of ethics, we really tried to understand what is it that matters to us and what do we think is important to convey to outsiders. So of course, the example that we want to cite here is a big data code of ethics that we've issued, but of course there are others that have done the same, and we highly encourage this, that essentially outlines our approach to big data. Now to be clear, and I should point out for Marko's sake as well, this isn't a legal document. So the point of this wasn't to create a document that would be, pointed out in court, but rather to give a sense of our philosophy and approach towards what we do. And so at the highlights here, we're using data that's lawful, public, legally provided, employment data that's not creepy. So the quote unquote creepy data capture are things that people haven't provided us voluntarily, things that we somehow sneakily manage to gather. We think it's important, I skipped a few. We think it's important to point out that domain expertise is key here. We need subject matter expertise and professionalism in terms of determining what data can be used and what data cannot. Being an independent third party means that we're ultimately responsible, and our clients can essentially point to Evolve as having a high standard when it comes to data capture. And then finally, data security, which is a source of a number of topics of conversation. Data security is incredibly important. This data needs to be firewalled, it needs to be warehoused. In many cases, it needs to be encrypted. You need to ensure that you're following the letter of the law, because we've all heard stories of data that's been compromised and the huge backlash that can create amongst clients, consumers, and employees. So that fourth point, technical expertise. The report encouraged a higher standard and more technical expertise when it comes to data usage. And what's really key here is that we're finding the market for tools and techniques is rapidly growing. We're finding that more and more people are being trained in these big data skills. It's exciting, but the big data market is maturing. We're now starting to see all of these tools, techniques, technologies, and people are being brought to bear to answer some really key questions. Now, likewise, while those people are being trained, and I would say within the past 5 years, we've seen the emergence of dozens of programs that allow people to earn a master's or PhD in data science, in analytics, in machine learning. So it's exciting. We're starting to churn out those scientists at a much more rapid pace to face the shortage that we have had for the last few years. However, those people can't just be trained in how to use data and how to analyze it. They need to understand the legalities and the ethics around the data. We can't be agnostic when it comes to those legal or ethical issues. So again, here at Evolve, while we have a number of people that are trained in using those data, we also have certain people that are experts, that are the go-to people when it comes to figuring out what's allowed and what's not. And when we're thinking about expertise, it's a little bit strange to say, but we think that it's important to have a broad approach, but a narrow focus. And let me explain what I mean by that. The broad approach simply refers to the fact that we need people trained in a variety of different disciplines. This is fundamentally an interdisciplinary endeavor. We need economists and statisticians. We need machine learning experts and engineers. We need industrial organizational psychologists. Those are the folks that we've brought on board because it's important to cover it from a number of different angles. At the same time,
but you also need lawyers, lots and lots of lawyers.
There you go. Excellent point. Absolutely. But likewise, you need a narrow focus. We want subject matter experts that are well versed in the nuances of dealing with people data. And likewise, to Marko's comment, you need lawyers, but you need lawyers that are very well versed in employment law specifically and understand some of the nuances of that arena. And then finally, the fifth point I want to make is that it's important to be collaborative. So if in engaging in a big data initiative, you look around and you see you don't have the expertise in-house, that's not necessarily a problem because it's possible to get that expertise in other ways. I should point out that it is important to have the expertise. So I'll show you an example in a second of when you apply the wrong set of models to data, you can land at the exact opposite conclusions. So we need that technical expertise, but the good news is if we don't see it around us, we can either hire those people in, we can partner with academics and universities, or we can outsource to vendors or contractors. So let me give everyone a very simple and powerful example of why the right methods and technical expertise matters. And this example actually emerges from World War II, when the British were losing a lot of bombers over Germany. And so they decided they needed to add armor to those planes. Now the armor was very expensive and heavy, so they realized they couldn't arm the entire plane. They only needed to choose the parts that were most vulnerable. Now conveniently, the British actually kept track of where the bombers had been shot when they came back from bombing runs. And so with those meticulous records, they were able to triangulate and overlay those transcripts, and they essentially got a sense of where planes had been shot. So they took a look at this data and said, okay, it's pretty clear. We need to put armor on the wings and the head and the tail. They brought in an Austrian economist named Abraham Wald, who looked at this exact data and said that's the exact opposite of what you want to do, because the planes that you're looking at are the planes that are returning from their bombing runs. The planes that are truly being shot in vulnerable spots are the ones that are being shot down over Germany. And so by using this sort of analysis, which is a good example of selection bias, they were able to arm the right parts of the plane, and ultimately thousands of British lives were saved. So in the example here, it's important to ensure that you have those technical chops, and you can look to different sources. Here at Evolve, we've actually looked towards universities as an opportunity to engage with the academic community. We've built partnerships with a half dozen schools, and we've used those partnerships in order to leverage the power of our data. So we recognized a couple years ago that it would be incredibly expensive to hire dozens of PhDs that are well-known experts in this field. Instead, we have kind of a will work for data approach. We provide them novel and proprietary data that they can use to generate insight. They deliver that insight for us and our clients, and lo and behold, they have interesting novel papers that they can then publish in academic journals. So that's a good way to satisfy the need for expertise when resources constraints won't allow us to draw it from in-house. So I wanted to leave some time for questions. I think we've got about 10 minutes. So let me pause here and open it up and see if there are any questions about anything that Marko or myself had presented about.
Michael, this is Marko. So let me ask you this question. Of all the research you've done, what do you think is the most surprising or interesting finding you found that correlates to big data to a workplace success factor?
Yeah, I would think what's interesting is what we found doesn't predict, I think, is almost the most fascinating. We've systematically looked at, I mentioned work history before. We've looked at previous job relevant experience for certain roles. We've even looked at criminal conviction data. We've actually found that for all three of those, they tend not to predict. So what's fascinating is we know what recruiters look for, and they're looking for all of those factors and making very quick decisions because they have large piles of resume to go through. It's almost more surprising that we find very little statistical significance in those relationships. We found that what does predict tends to be not where you have been in the past. It's actually you are fit for the job in the future. So knowledge, skills, abilities, behavioral attributes, psychometric attributes, those things tend to be much stronger predictors of how long someone is going to stay and how well they are going to perform.
Great.
Interesting.
Sorry, go ahead.
There may be other questions.
Yeah, we did get one, and I'll just throw it over the fence. It seems like it's prime for Dr. Housman here. But the question asks, can you please go over the legal implications of using correlative versus causal models?
Yeah, and actually Marko might be just as well, if not more suited to talk specifically about that. Marko, do you have thoughts on that question?
Well, yes, because statistically the difference between a correlative and a causative factor is really not very significant, because cause is simply a philosophical conclusion, really, that we apply to a correlation. What data have the ability to tell us is whether two events have some run in tandem or don't run in tandem, whether they seem to be sort of random events relative to one another, or whether there's either a positive or negative connection. So it may be, for example, that people with the last name starting with the letter A are more frequently hired in your business, and they tend to do better when they're hired. Well, there's obviously not a causation that you can think of, but if you have a strong correlation there, you would want to look and see what's going on, and whether, for example, what's happening is they're being sorted alphabetically and people are making their assessments of candidates starting with A and they just never get really much through it, or whether they tend to start their performance review process with the letter A and that's making a difference. So you would be looking, and you would not expect a causation factor. On the other hand, if you look at educational background, you might expect that to be causation, but really what you're measuring statistically is a correlation. So I've often thought that many times people are more comfortable when they can see cause and effect or something that they label cause and effect than when what they see is and label as correlation. So for example, people are more likely to, let's say they're more likely to pass a test the second time they take it. Well, that makes sense to us, so we label it causation. If it doesn't make sense to us, we call it correlation. But when you're in court and trying to defend yourself, you use the same statistical models, whether you're trying to prove causation or correlation, and they both seem to work pretty much the same way and equally well. You know, if you could prove causation not using statistical models, that would be a little bit better. You know, for example, it's 100% true that tall people are taller than short people. That's why you label it tall and short, but that's just circular. So in general, when you're trying to deal with what appear to be independent factors and determine whether they're connected to one another, the difference between causation and correlation is more in the minds of the wordsmith than it is in the minds of the people putting on evidence and trying to prove one or the other.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and let me, I'll actually have a specific example from Evolve's experience that I think it actually answers this really well, which is in the course of mining the data that we capture, one of the things that we do get when someone logs into the platform is we get a kind of footprint of their browser, the browser they use to access the platform. And what we found in the course of just doing analysis with our analytics team is that browser was a predictor of workforce performance. We found Chrome and Firefox users performed better on the job than people that used Internet Explorer or Safari. Really interesting stuff. That we know that is correlative, that it's not because you took the assessment on that browser made you do well. It's probably because you're tech savvy, or you maybe took more time to install a new browser on your computer that you thought would allow you to be more productive. But the relationship was very robust. Now, I want to point out, Evolve deliberately does not use that information in spite of the fact that it's very predictive. And we don't use it for two reasons. One is we consider that shadow data capture. So while the data is in there, we're not clear about whether that would be used. And so we're very clear about making sure it's never used in scoring. Number two is that we believe there may be some conflation with protected classes. We think, for example, that your choice of browser might be related to your age. We know that we can't choose on the basis of age. And so that browser usage is a really good example of kind of everything we've talked about here, which is it's not causal, it's a correlative factor. We see a very strong relationship, but we've deliberately decided not to use that when assigning assessment scores for the reasons that I mentioned in this presentation. And so it's one of those things where even if you can do the analysis, you want to take a step back and say, is this something we could plausibly use?